Last week, English primatologist and anthropologist Jane Goodall died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 91. And while this is obviously very sad, this news does offer me a unique opportunity to make a second video in a month where I get to talk about Bigfoot. That's right. It's not the most important part of the Goodall legacy, but, it's fun and close to my heart. So yes, many times over the years, Goodall has gone on the record to say that while she didn't outright believe that Bigfoot existed, she couldn't necessarily dismiss it. For instance, it most recently came up, I think, in this interview with GQ in 2021, when she said, "I was in Ecuador. We'd flown for 2 solid hours over unbroken forest in a small plain, and we visited 4 tiny little communities, 30 to 50 people, no roads, and they communicate with each other by means of like in the old days. It was the town crier, but these are hunters actually, and they carry the news from one village to another and letters and things like that. So I had an interpreter, and I said to him, when you next meet one of these hunters, could you ask if they've ever seen a monkey without a tail? 3 of the hunters came back and said, oh yeah, we've seen monkeys without tails. They walk upright and they're about 6 foot tall. Now this was an interpreter from the village. He knew nothing about Bigfoot, nothing at all. Every single country has its version. Yeti, Yowie in Australia, Wild Man in China. So I don't know if it's perhaps a myth that stems from maybe the last of the Neanderthals. But then is the last of the Neanderthals still living in these remote forests? I don't know. But I'm not going to say it doesn't exist, and I'm not going to say people who believe in it are stupid. Okay, so a few things raised some flags for me. For a start, you're saying that someone in a remote Ecuadorian village knew English well enough to serve as a translator. How do we know he's never heard of Bigfoot? But even if he hadn't, many different cultures around the world have this idea of a wild man or human-like creature lurking in the wilderness. That doesn't mean it's real. Anthropologists, not named Jane Goodall, have spent decades studying something called comparative mythology. Why do different cultures independently develop the same types of fairy tales, for instance, with very similar story structures? Why do they independently name their gods similar things and give them similar powers? Why do they come up with similar ideas for how the world was created? These studies are really interesting because they point to something that might be inherently human, something shared across cultures and across time. Personally, I think that's more interesting than maybe there really is a big ape thing that defies all biological realities, but, that's just me. And before I get off topic, here's one more possible explanation. Maybe that translator was fucking with her. A 6 foot tall tailless monkey? Yeah, lady, they're all over the place. I know one named Uncle Carl. All that said, even though I was initially in the early years disappointed when Goodall first gave credence to the idea that maybe Bigfoot is real, these days I'm a little more sympathetic. Because it seems like she maybe just had this naive, childlike hope that there's something weird and interesting out there. And also it feels like maybe she's a little bit protective of first world colonists mocking indigenous culture. Which brings me to a topic that, unlike her interest in Bigfoot, hasn't been featured in many of the news stories about Goodall's life and work, which is what a crucial role was played in that life and work by colonialism. I've been thinking of it recently thanks to Michelle A. Rodriguez, a primatologist and biological anthropologist who was inspired to go into that work in part because of Jane Goodall. Years ago, she happened to watch the 2017 documentary Jane, and she was struck by the narrative presented of one lone white English scientist who braved the jungles of Africa to single-handedly make landmark discoveries and conserve that threatened environment. In an essay, Rodriguez presents what is left unsaid. First, the way colonialism is inextricably tangled in Goodall's success. Her upbringing was middle class, but she was related to nobility, which connected her to the Queen and allowed her access to Louis Leakey, the famous paleoanthropologist who sent her to British-occupied Tanganyika. Leakey himself was in British-occupied Kenya because of his Church of England missionary family colonizing British East Africa. Goodall and her work were first famously photographed for National Geographic by Baron Hugo van Lawick, a member of the Dutch nobility who grew up in the Dutch East Indies, now known as Indonesia. She later married him, which made her a baroness. Rodriguez doesn't mention this, but Goodall's second husband was Derek Bryson, the only white British member of the Tanzanian parliament and the director of their national park system at the time that they met. None of this diminishes Goodall's incredible legacy, just like my own comparatively tiny accomplishments aren't diminished by acknowledging that I have benefited wildly from white supremacy and from a comfortable middle class upbringing. But as Rodriguez points out, ignoring the colonial elephant in the room leads directly to these accounts that ignore the important work done by the people around Goodall, the Tanzanian scientists working in the background, the locals who work just as hard alongside Goodall to protect their fragile ecosystem. They were there and they are still there, and personally, I can't name a single one. And the thing is, I think Goodall would have loved for the press to focus more on these people and their stories. In recent years, she actually became more and more outspoken about how she was able to accomplish so much, thanks in part to being a beautiful white woman, a double-edged sword that, yes, led her male peers to dismiss and harass her, but it also led the press to celebrate her and, give her more attention than she would have received otherwise. She even started to comment upon colonialism itself in the way that more powerful countries profited off of the destruction and subjugation of Africa, its people, its flora and fauna. Unfortunately, a lot of that ended up in her 2013 book, Seeds of Hope, which is a mess of plagiarized garbage that had to be delayed in order to remove stolen passages that came from Wikipedia, the Choice Organic Teas website, and an astrology website. Yikes. But in the book that was eventually published, hopefully with no more plagiarized passages, she acknowledges both the importance of indigenous knowledge and how colonialism exploits and destroys the global South. I don't think she would have objected to a documentary that, as Rodriguez puts it, tells the stories behind the stories. After all, one of the great things Goodall did was to establish the Jane Goodall Institute, which sponsors a lot of conservation projects around the world, but is particularly focused on community activism, sponsoring and educating young people in Tanzania, in Uganda, Ecuador, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, to empower them to take action to make the world a better place for animals, people, and the environment. Why wouldn't she want the world to know the names of the people who she inspired and helped to go on to carry on her life's mission? Of course she would. She literally died while on a lecture tour, and before she died, left a message of hope for future generations to keep working hard to protect the planet. I genuinely think that she was proud that her legacy wasn't just going to end with her. It was going to be carried on by all of these other people who she helped inspire. So while it's sad that Jane Goodall has died, it's worth remembering that despite the narrative in National Geographic and various documentaries, she was more than just her landmark research, which was incredible and important. She dedicated the latter part of her life using her fame to spread hope and actually plant the seeds for new generations of environmental stewards. And hopefully one day we will know their names just as well as we know Jane Goodall's. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.